Welcome back to another book highlight. Now we're actually not moving forward to another chapter in My Rival the King because we are at the end and we still have a couple more to talk about. But I don't want to leave the subject of Jonathan's death just yet. In the previous video, we talked about Jonathan's death, the end of his life in the Gilboa battle. Saul and Jonathan and almost all the rest of Saul's sons died except one. That was still back in their fortress city. But we talked about how Jonathan's death teaches us about trusting God with our past, our present, and our future. But there's so much in this. There's so many rich lessons that we can learn. I wanted to stick with it for a little bit longer and talk about Jonathan's focus on eternity. Now, of course, in his lifetime, he didn't know Jesus. He was Old Testament. He didn't know about salvation through Jesus and the promise of eternity and heaven as we understand it after Christ's death and resurrection in the AD world. But Jonathan was a faithful follower of God, and God honored his legacy. We've talked about that, how what Scripture chooses to include about Jonathan shows us this. Scripture specifically says God put Saul to death, but it says nothing about God turning away from Jonathan or against him. Jonathan's death was simply a part of that battle. A lot of faithful followers of God fell in those ancient battles as they do today. So we talked about that already, about how Jonathan's death is not necessarily a sign of God punishing him or turning away from him, and there's even more evidence for that. So going back to my original point, even though Jonathan didn't understand eternity the way we do through Christ, we can see from his recorded actions that he did understand eternity from the fact that his decisions were not made based solely on an earthly mindset, earthly values. The character I developed in the novel, the character of Jonathan, is very hurt by the fact that Saul's actions became more and more selfish over time. They were earthbound and driven by the fear of man and not the fear of God. He didn't think about how his decisions would affect his family or if they were pleasing to God. And Jonathan was too close to some of those decisions, and he died because he was too connected to Saul's failed choices that dragged a lot of good men down. What a terrible thing to be the catalyst for the destruction of your army and your family. But Jonathan was making heavenward decisions. His covenant with David was something he was mature enough to enter into in the first place. The covenant came from God. It was inspired by God, who knit their hearts together. It's what Scripture says. And that was God's mercy for them and for their descendants. It was God's mercy for David to have another God-loving man in his life to lift him up and train him and guard him. And it was God's mercy for Jonathan to have a chance to be part of what he was doing through David and ultimately affect his future generations for good and draw a line of faith in the sand for them that would counteract what Saul was doing. Jonathan, as I say in my Bible study, God can't bind your heart to someone unless your heart is his to begin with. That covenant and all Jonathan's subsequent decisions toward David were made with God's will and the future in mind, and that's how he was focused on eternity. He was focused on the fact that David was chosen by God out of mercy, not just judgment, because he chose David because he loved Israel and wanted it to go forward. And Jonathan also loved Israel and wanted her to continue. And so he chose to embrace David as the way forward for his nation because God chose him. That was eternal focus. He was not so caught up in the fact that he wasn't going to be the next king. He cared more about the direction Israel was going. In my novel, as Jonathan gets closer to death, his prayers become more and more future-focused, more faith-filled and full of clarity. At first, he's just clinging to hope and then speaking in faith to hold himself together. But then he becomes more prophetic as he gets closer to death, and his prayers are all focused on what's beyond his natural life, which is the continuation of God's plan and will. He says things like, save Israel and keep her as the apple of your eye. Save David and make him the kind of king that pleases you. Save Mephi, his son, Mephibosheth, who I nicknamed. All of that is future focused. It's beyond his life, and yet he was committed to what God would do for them. God honored that faith in a beautiful, powerful way. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about Mephi in the weeks to come, in future videos in My Father the King. And Scripture gives us a few big hints about him, the kind of struggles he had, but we don't really know what kind of man he was. And yet everything he gained, the wealth and relationships and the fact that his life was spared, in fact, he was the only one of Saul's descendants who was not subsequently killed after David became king. All of that was not due to Mephi's merit, but Jonathan's. Mephi might have been a good man, but he didn't do anything to earn what David gave him. It was due to Jonathan's merit. Jonathan was a type of Christ in this way. When David looked at Mephi, he saw Jonathan. And when God looks at us who are saved, he sees Christ, the one who laid down his life because he trusted God's plan. That's how Jonathan represents someone who's focused on eternity. Eternity is not just a place, it's going on already. It's God's kingdom outside of time, God's will and plan outside of time. And so one of the biggest ways we can honor God is by living and speaking and acting and making decisions under what James calls the law of liberty, in light of eternity, in light of what we've been given by God and what future generations are going to need. That's what the book of Hebrews says when it talks about the cloud of witnesses. Other generations have set us up with their faithfulness, and we're setting others up while they're cheering us on. So our decisions as believers should not just be about us right here and right now. And that is something that David and Jonathan both teach us, but specifically Jonathan, even in his death, was thinking about the future, was thinking about God's will headed into the future. And even though he couldn't control that, he was trusting God, even though he couldn't fully understand or like everything that he was seeing. He was relying on God's wisdom for the future, and we can too.